Welcome to our next video. This one is called Paul, Preacher, Apostle, and Teacher. First Timothy 2:7, Paul writes, "For this I was appointed a preacher and an apostle, a teacher of the Gentiles in faith and truth." The words used here for preacher are kerix, and an apostle, apostolos, and a teacher, didaskalos. And in 2 Timothy 1:11, he says the same thing, "For which I was appointed a preacher and apostle and teacher." Preacher, apostle, and teacher, Paul. If we look back again at Ephesians 4:11 and chapter 4, verses 11 and 12, we see that Christ gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the shepherds, and teachers to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for the building up of the body of Christ. And he gave the apostles. Now, Paul uses the word preacher here in the original two passages we looked at. Kerix. Kerix is defined as a herald or a public crier. A herald or a public crier. Compare the word evangelist, one who announces good news. A herald, a public crier, one who announces, evangelist. Compare those two and see if they're not similar. So let's look at apostle. Apostolos, a delegate. That Greek word means a delegate, a messenger, one sent forth with orders. In Acts 9:15, we see that Paul was appointed by Jesus Christ, where the text reads, "He, Paul, is a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel." Preacher and apostle. And finally, Paul calls himself a teacher, didaskalos. Think about Paul's upbringing. He was educated in the Old Testament at the feet of Gamaliel, according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers, Acts 22:3. Paul, as a teacher, was born in Tarsus, which is a major center of Greek learning in the first century. And Paul was also a Roman citizen, fluent in Greek and Hebrew. So as a teacher, he had an education, and he was fluent in Greek and Hebrew. So Paul was a preacher to Gentiles, kings, and the sons of Israel. He was an apostle, chosen, appointed, and ordered by Christ, and a teacher to and organized churches. Let's look at the characteristics of Paul and his work. 1, he was an evangelist, a preacher, a baptizer. The New Testament Greek words most often translated as preacher are kerix, and kerisso means to preach or proclaim, and evangelizo, meaning to preach the good news. So as an evangelist, he was also a baptizer. Let's look at 1 Corinthians 1, verses 14 and 17. Paul writes, "I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius, so that no one may say that you were baptized in my name." He says, I did baptize also the household of Stephanas. So here we know that Paul was a baptizer. He baptized Crispus and Gaius and the household of Stephanas, and that's just in the Corinthian church. And he says, continues, beyond that, I do not know whether I baptized anyone else. For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel. And preach the gospel here is evangelize. Again, that's 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 14 through 17. Let's compare something that John says about Jesus. John 4, verses 1 and 2. Now when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, and John puts a parenthesis here, although Jesus himself did not baptize, but only his disciples. Jesus himself did not baptize, but only his disciples. Now when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, that's a true statement. Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself did not baptize, but only his disciples. So let's compare what Paul said. For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel. Certainly when he preached the gospel, people were baptized. So his disciples probably did most of that, just as his master, Jesus, baptized. Jesus preached, the disciples baptized. Paul preached, his disciples baptized. Not his disciples, but the disciples, the students that he was teaching, the people, the Christians among him. So we see that Paul was an evangelist and he was a baptizer, and he was bivocational, which means he was able to support himself in his evangelism. If we look at Acts 18, verses 3 and 4, and Acts 20, verses 33 and 34. And Paul went to see them, Aquila and Priscilla, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. And in addition to working, he also reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and tried to persuade Jews and Greeks. That was his evangelism. That was his preaching. So he was a bivocational preacher. But Paul also received support. 2 Corinthians 11:3. Paul said, I robbed other churches by accepting support from them in order to serve you. He was a traveling preacher, much like his master, Jesus. The New Testament mentions, just in Asia alone, these churches, these cities: Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea, Colossae, and Hierapolis, among others. And Paul worked with partners. From the scriptures we can see he worked with many partners, but if you look at Romans 16:3 and 2 Corinthians 8:23, some of his fellow workers was Aquila, Priscilla, and Titus, Timothy, Luke, and others. Paul also was not married. 1 Corinthians 7, verse 8 and 28. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. He calls it a gift from God in verse 7. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. Yet those who marry will have worldly troubles, and I would spare you that. So Paul was unmarried. So looking back at the gifts in Ephesians 4 that Jesus gave the church, he gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the shepherds, and teachers to equip the saints for the work of ministry for building up the body of Christ. So let's apply this. Paul was a preacher, apostle, and teacher. And Jesus gave the gifts of apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, and teachers. We teach that the apostles and the prophets, those two offices have passed away in the first and early part of the second century. And what's left are the evangelists, shepherds, and teachers. In your church, which of these are there? Teachers? All right, let's go back. Let's see in your church. Do you have evangelists? Do you have shepherds? Do you have teachers? Are you praying for evangelists, shepherds, and teachers? If you don't have shepherds, what do you need? Which of these appoints shepherds? Let's look at Titus 1:5. This is why I left you in Crete, Paul writes, so that you, Titus, might put what remained into order and appoint elders in every town as I directed you. Titus and Timothy are known as evangelists in the first century church. So yes, it's evangelists which appoints shepherds. And who is qualified to function as an evangelist? Would Paul be qualified? Let's look at Paul again. He was a baptizer, a preacher. He could support himself. He could receive support from churches. He traveled a lot. He worked with partners. He was a mentor and teacher, and he was not married. Would Paul be qualified to be an evangelist in your church? If you are a church that's not organized with elders and deacons, you should have an evangelist. You need to recognize that need. Again, just ask the question, is your church organized with elders and deacons, bishops and deacons, shepherds and deacons, pastors and deacons? These are synonymous words when we study the eldership. Is your congregation, is it growing? Is it spreading the word? How long has it been this way? Do you need another pulpit minister or pastor or whatever you call it? Or do you really need an evangelist? If you recognize the need for an evangelist because you're a church that doesn't have elders and deacons, qualified elders and deacons, pray for that need to be filled. Call for candidates. Get to know your candidates. And then appoint one or two. It could be a plurality of evangelists, but appoint him or them to do the work of an evangelist. And that's a short lesson on Paul, the preacher, the apostle, the teacher. Are you a disciple of Jesus? God is calling you. If you want to know how to become a Christian, just look at the first gospel sermon in Acts chapter 2 and read it through and see what God is calling you to do. Until next time, God bless.